The prairie had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the sigh of the wind across the tall grass and the cry of a hawk overhead. It was late autumn in the 1800s. When the nights came early and the days were sharp with cold and the frontier felt like the edge of the world, a lone rider moved along the trail, his coat worn, his hat pulled low, his rifle tied across the saddle. He had known hard winters before, but nothing prepared him for the sight that stopped his horse in its tracks that evening. There, lying in the dust of the trail, was a child. The boy could not have been more than 3 or 4 years old. His tiny frame was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his lips dry and cracked from thirst. His eyes fluttered weakly, as if he had been holding on to life with nothing but sheer will. The rider dismounted quickly, kneeling beside him. He could see at once the child was Apache, left to the mercy of the land. Whether he had wandered from a band or had been abandoned, there was no way to know. The man glanced at the horizon, half expecting riders to appear, but the land stretched out empty in every direction. He picked the boy up in his arms, feeling how light he was, almost as if the wind might carry him away. There was no time to hesitate. He lifted the child onto his horse and began the slow ride back toward his cabin, a modest place built from rough timber at the edge of the plains. The journey back felt longer than usual. Every few minutes he checked the boy's breathing, whispering words the child was too weak to hear. When they reached the cabin, the rider set the boy gently on a bed near the fire. He boiled water, crushed what roots and dried herbs he had, and coaxed tiny sips between the child's lips. The boy stirred faintly, but his eyes stayed shut. The man sat nearby through the night, stoking the fire, watching over him. There was no way of knowing if the boy would survive until morning. By the 4th day, the boy's strength began to return. He could sit up, though his small body trembled with the effort. He ate slowly, each bite of cornbread and broth seeming to surprise him. His dark eyes followed every movement, cautious but not afraid. The rider noticed the way the boy listened to the crackle of the fire, to the creak of the wood, to the sound of the wind pressing against the walls of the cabin. There was sharpness in him, the kind that came from surviving. Yet even as the boy grew stronger, a weight pressed on the rider's mind. He knew that finding an Apache child alone on the prairie was no small thing. Families did not let their little ones stray far. A child meant there were others, somewhere, and if they came looking, what would they make of finding him here, under the roof of a white settler? On the morning of the 4th day, while the boy sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, the rider stepped outside. The sky was clear, the sun still low, the land wide and open. His hand rested on the post of the porch as his eyes scanned the distance. He thought he saw movement, a flicker along the ridge, but the next instant it was gone. He told himself it might have been a deer. Yet deep inside, he knew better. He spent the rest of the day uneasy, his rifle leaning by the door, his ears tuned to every sound. The boy played quietly with a small wooden horse, tracing its shape with thin fingers, still too tired for more. When night fell, the man hardly slept. The next day brought answers. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when he heard the crunch of footsteps on dry grass. He turned sharply, and what he saw rooted him where he stood. 3 Apache women approached the cabin. Their long dark hair was bound with strips of leather, their clothing stitched from tanned hides that moved with the wind. They walked with steady purpose, their eyes fixed on him. But it was not hostility that struck him most. It was the silence, the gravity of their presence. The boy inside the cabin seemed to sense it too. He rose from the blanket, toddled to the doorway, and looked out. For a moment, the world stood still. The women stopped a few paces away, their faces unreadable. The rider tightened his grip on the child, who now clung to him instinctively. The air was heavy with tension, with unspoken questions. Who were these women to the boy? Sisters? Aunts? Perhaps his mother among them? And what would they think, finding him here in the arms of a stranger? The fire inside the cabin snapped, the only sound between them. The women exchanged glances, and then their eyes returned to the rider. One of them stepped forward, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. He felt the boy's small hands dig into his coat as though he feared being taken away. The rider's heart pounded. He knew whatever happened next could change everything, not just for the boy, but for himself as well. And there at the edge of his doorway, with 3 Apache women standing silent before him and a child in his arms, the story truly began. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what choice would be made. Would they demand the boy back? Would they see the man as an enemy? Or had fate drawn them together for a reason neither side yet understood? The rider's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. The boy's eyes darted between the women and the man holding him, as if he too sensed the weight of the moment. The prairie wind carried the scent of smoke from the cabin's fire, swirling around them all. Nothing about the world felt ordinary anymore. And in that silence, with danger and possibility pressing from every side, the rider realized that his life had shifted onto a path from which there was no turning back. The women did not move closer. They stood in a line unyielding, their shadows stretching across the ground. The boy shifted in the man's arms, and for the first time, he spoke a single word in his native tongue, word that seemed to strike the women like a spark in dry grass. Their faces changed, their eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. The rider felt the weight of that moment sink into his bones. He did not yet understand what the word meant, but he knew it bound them all together in ways he could not escape. The cabin door creaked in the wind. The man took a step back, but his eyes never left the women. The boy clung tighter, and with the prairie stretched wide around them, the fire glowing behind and the weight of the unknown pressing forward, he understood that his quiet life at the edge of the world had just ended. Everything from here on would be different. Would these women take the child and vanish back into the land? Would they see him as a threat or as a man who had saved one of their own? He could not tell. And the not knowing was worse than any danger he had faced before. The boy's small voice echoed again, fragile but clear. The women shifted, their expressions tightening. The rider braced himself, waiting for what would come, yet knowing deep inside this was only the beginning. The silence between the cabin and the 3 Apache women stretched on, heavy as stone. The rider shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the hard earth, and the boy clung tighter to him. The women said nothing, yet their eyes told him they had come with purpose. Their gazes shifted between the child and the man holding him, as though weighing what had been done and what must come next. He had lived long enough on the edge of the frontier to know that every gesture mattered. A wrong word, a careless movement, could tip everything toward danger. He took a slow breath, forcing his voice steady. The boy was starving, he said, though he doubted they understood all his words. I found him. I kept him alive. His tone was not pleading, but simple truth. The women remained still. The one who had stepped forward tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking toward the child, then back to him. The boy's small hand fisted in his coat, refusing to let go. That single act unsettled him. In only a handful of days, the child had formed a bond, fragile but real. It's clinging as though he trusted him more than the faces standing across the yard. It made the rider wonder what had happened before he found him. Why was the boy alone in the first place? Had there been an attack? A separation? Or something darker? He could not ask, and they would not tell. The rider thought back to his own past as he stood there. The boy pressed against his chest. He had come west years earlier, leaving behind the noise of towns and the weight of war. He had wanted only quiet, a chance to carve out a living far from men's quarrels. He had built his cabin with his own hands, laid each timber and stone, telling himself he needed no one. But the prairie had its own way of undoing a man's plans. Now here he was, standing at his doorway, with strangers who carried the weight of a whole people behind them. The women's silence was not empty, it was watchful, testing. They were reading him, measuring whether the boy's survival was an act of kindness or something else. He raised his free hand, palm open, showing he carried no weapon. The rifle leaned just inside the cabin, but reaching for it now would end everything. One of the women shifted slightly, and he noticed the glint of a knife at her waist, the feathers braided into her hair. They had come prepared for whatever they might find. The boy broke the stillness again, murmuring that word he had spoken before, his small voice tugging something deep in the women. This time, the one standing forward let out a low sound, almost like a sigh, her eyes softening. The rider caught it, the subtle change, and knew it meant something important. Still, she did not move closer. The day wore on under that uneasy standoff. At last the women stepped back, not retreating but choosing distance. Without a word, they turned and walked toward the ridge they had come from. The rider stood frozen, unsure whether to be relieved or more troubled. They did not take the boy, nor did they try to speak. They simply left, leaving the question hanging heavier than before. That night, the child slept restlessly, tossing beneath the blanket. The man stayed awake, staring into the fire, turning the day's events over and over in his mind. He could not shake the image of the women's eyes, or the sound of that word the boy had spoken. It was as if the land itself had shifted beneath his feet, dragging him into a story he did not yet understand. In the days that followed, he tried to keep life steady. He split wood, tended his small garden patch, checked the traps he set along the creek. The boy followed him everywhere, his steps uncertain but eager, his dark eyes soaking in every movement. The rider began teaching him simple words, pointing to objects: the fire, the horse, the sky. Sometimes the boy answered back in Apache words the man could not understand, but the bond between them grew. Yet the memory of those women did not fade. He knew they would return. People did not let their kin vanish without answers. The question was not if, but when. And when they did, what would they want of him? Gratitude, judgment, vengeance. He could not tell. One afternoon, while gathering water at the creek, the rider found tracks in the mud. Not his, not the boy's, but fresh. The marks of moccasins pressed into the damp earth. His hand tightened on the handle of the bucket as he scanned the tree line. The silence around him felt thick, as though he was being watched. He carried the water back quickly, his eyes never leaving the ridges. That evening, the boy sat by the fire, humming softly to himself. The rider listened, realizing it was not random sound. It was a tune, simple and low. Perhaps something his mother had sung to him. The thought twisted something in his chest. Somewhere out there, someone had sung that song. Now the boy carried it alone. As the days turned colder, the man began to think more about the women's silence. Maybe they were testing him, watching to see what kind of man he was, before they decided what to do. The prairie was wide, but it was never truly empty. Eyes could be on him at any moment. At night, he sometimes dreamed of fire on the horizon, of riders sweeping across the plains. He woke with his heart pounding, the boy curled beside him. Small and fragile, yet bound to him by a thread neither of them had chosen. The past, too, began to stir in him. Memories of battles fought years earlier, when men wore uniforms and the land shook with musket fire. He had seen enough killing to last a lifetime, and had left that world behind. But now, holding an Apache child, standing before Apache women, he feared that old ghosts might rise again. One morning, as he was mending the fence near the cabin, he caught sight of movement at the edge of the field. The same 3 women stood there once more, silent as before, but this time they did not turn away. They waited, as though inviting him to make the first move. The boy spotted them too, and his little body tensed, torn between the man's steady arms and the figures who seemed to call him wordlessly. The rider's heart beat hard. He knew this was no chance meeting. This was the moment when the silence would have to break, when something hidden would have to come to light. He brushed the dirt from his hands, straightened, and stepped toward them. The boy clinging tight, he felt the air sharpen, as though the prairie itself was holding its breath again. The boy spoke that same word, louder now, a note of recognition or longing in his voice. The women's faces changed, shadows of grief and hope crossing them all at once. The man stopped a few paces away, his voice low but firm. "I mean him no harm," he said. "I saved him." The words fell into the space between them, carried by the wind. The women did not answer. One of them raised her hand slowly, not in threat, but in a gesture that seemed to say there was more to be told. More than he yet understood. The rider stood rooted, torn between giving the boy into their care or keeping him close. The child clung harder, and in that grip was trust. perhaps undeserved, but real. And in that moment, under the open sky, he realized that no matter what was about to happen, the quiet life he had carved out on the edge of the frontier was gone forever. The truth of who the boy was, and why he had been left alone, still hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The women's eyes held stories he could not yet read, and until those stories came forth, the tension would not ease. And so he stood there, the boy in his arms, the fire of the prairie sun burning above, and the shadows of 3 women before him. Something larger than himself was unfolding, something he could neither fight nor escape. The air between the man and the 3 Apache women felt as sharp as a drawn blade. He stood in the open, the boy tight in his arms, the prairie stretching endless around them. Yet all that space seemed to shrink until only the 4 of them remained in the world. The child's dark eyes flicked from the man's face to the women's steady gaze, as if he were caught between 2 worlds and unsure where he belonged. The rider had known hard standoffs before, but none like this. This was not about land or cattle or pride. This was about blood, about kin, about survival. The woman who had stepped forward last time raised her hand again, palm out, but not in threat. It was a quiet signal, almost like a mother coaxing a child. The boy stirred, his small body pulling toward her instinctively, though his fingers still dug into the man's coat. That simple struggle to pull toward one side while clinging to the other spoke volumes. The rider felt it, the weight of it pressing on his chest. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, in halting English, one of the women said, "He is ours." Her voice was low, thick with an accent, but sharp with certainty. The words were not shouted. They were not even angry, but they carried the strength of something final. The man's jaw tightened. "I found him starving," he answered. "I kept him alive." His words sounded almost defensive, though he hadn't meant them that way. He wanted them to know he had not stolen the boy, had not hidden him, had only done what any decent man would have done when he saw a child alone on the trail. The women's faces did not change, but he saw a flicker in their eyes, perhaps surprise that he spoke without fear, or perhaps the shadow of doubt. The boy pressed his cheek against the man's chest, silent now, waiting as if the decision about his life was being made above his head. The man thought of what little he knew of the Apache. He had traded at times, met a few on hunts, but never stood face to face with their women like this. He had heard stories told in town, most of them twisted, filled with fear and half-truths. But standing here, he saw not savages, but women, hardened by the land, carrying dignity in their silence. That did not make them less dangerous. Inside, questions gnawed at him. Why had the boy been left alone in the first place? Had there been a raid? An attack? Was his family gone? Or was there something else, something the women weren't telling him? And if the boy truly belonged to them, why had they not taken him immediately when they first appeared? Why leave him behind and return days later? He felt the weight of the boy grow heavier in his arms, though the child was light as ever. The women did not step forward. Instead, the one who had spoken turned and motioned with her chin toward the hills. He understood it as a command, or perhaps an invitation. They wanted him to follow. That night he could not sleep. He sat by the fire, the boy curled close, the crackle of flames filling the silence. He thought of the women waiting somewhere beyond the ridge. If he followed, he might find answers, yet he might also step into danger he could not escape. If he stayed, the boy might always be a point of contention, a tether tying him to something larger than himself. The child stirred in his sleep, mumbling the same word he had spoken before, the one that made the women's faces change. The man whispered, "Who are you, little one? What do they see in you?" The boy only sighed and drifted back to sleep. The days that followed grew colder. The wind swept across the prairie with the bite of winter coming early. The rider went about his chores, but his eyes never left the ridges. He felt watched, though he never caught sight of anyone. Once, while gathering wood, he found a feather bound in leather left on the path. It was not his. It was a sign, deliberate, meant for him to find. He began to think more of the boy's future. If he stayed with him, would the child grow up between 2 worlds belonging to neither? If he returned to the women, would he vanish forever from the man's life, leaving behind only questions? The conflict gnawed at him, a slow ache that had no easy answer. At the same time, another trouble stirred on the edge of the horizon. He had heard rumors from traders passing through that tensions between settlers and Apache bands were rising again. A rancher's cattle had gone missing. A wagon had been attacked. Whispers of vengeance carried through saloon doors. The man knew too well how quickly whispers could turn to action, how fear could spark bloodshed. If word spread that he had an Apache child under his roof, trouble would find him sooner or later. That knowledge pulled him into deeper worry. Not only did he face the mystery of the boy's kin, but also the suspicion of his own people. Out here, loyalty was demanded, and gray lines were seldom tolerated. He could already imagine the stares, the muttered accusations. Was he harboring the enemy? Was he playing both sides? One evening, as he brought in the last of the wood, he heard the soft thud of hooves. His hand went instantly to the rifle near the door. 3 silhouettes appeared against the fading sky, the women again, this time on horseback. They did not approach too close, but their presence was clear, deliberate. The boy saw them from the doorway, his small frame tense, his eyes wide with something between recognition and fear. The rider stepped outside slowly, rifle in hand, but held low, not raised. The women waited. One of them spoke again, her English broken but direct. He must come. The words echoed through him. He wanted to ask where, to whom, and why, but he knew the limits of language between them. Still, he tried. Where his family? His voice was steady, but inside he wrestled with a storm. The woman did not answer in words. She pointed toward the distant hills again, her eyes steady. It was not a demand shouted in anger. It was something deeper, a pull of blood and belonging. The man stood frozen. The boy clung to his leg now, silent, unwilling to move. The women waited, their horses shifting restlessly, the sky darkening around them. The moment stretched until finally, without a word, they turned their horses and rode back into the dusk. That night, the man lay awake, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. The boy slept beside him, but even in dreams, his little hands reached out, gripping the blanket tight as if afraid of being taken. The rider stared into the dark, knowing the choice before him would not vanish. The women would return. And when they did, the boy might not cling so tightly. He began to wonder if there was more at stake than just kinship. Perhaps the boy held some meaning to them, something beyond blood. The way they reacted to his voice, the way they left signs instead of forcing their will, hinted at something greater. The man could not name it, but he felt it. And so he lived in the grip of 2 conflicts. One was with the women who claimed the boy and the mystery of why he had been left alone. The other was with the world of settlers, who would not understand why a man like him had chosen to protect an Apache child. Both pulled at him, both dangerous, and both leading toward a reckoning he could not avoid. Each day stretched with unease. Each shadow across the ridge carried meaning. Each word the boy spoke in his own tongue reminded him of all he did not know. The man had survived war, hunger, and loneliness, but this waiting, this unspoken conflict gnawed at him more than any battle he had fought, and as the prairie wind howled through the night, the fire flickering low, he knew the standoff was far from over. The women would return, the settlers' whispers would grow louder, and the truth of the child's place in the world would cut through all of it sooner or later, but not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, the cabin stood in silence. A fragile refuge at the edge of the world, holding a man, a boy, and the shadows of 3 women who had not yet said their final word. The day shortened, and the cold pressed harder against the prairie. The man had known long winters before, but never with this weight hanging over his cabin. Every sound outside set him on edge, the snap of a branch, the distant call of a coyote, the echo of hooves he could not always place. The boy had grown stronger, his cheeks no longer hollow, his steps steadier, yet with each passing day he seemed more watchful. Sometimes the child would look to the horizon, as if expecting to see familiar figures cresting the ridge. Other times, he pressed himself close to the man's side, Unwilling to be parted even for a moment, the rider had no illusions about how fragile his peace had become. The Apache women had not come again for several weeks, but that absence did not comfort him. It only meant they were waiting, watching, perhaps choosing the right time. He knew enough about life on the frontier to understand that patience was as sharp a weapon as any knife. What unsettled him more was the growing murmur from the town, a half-day's ride away. Word had reached his ears that settlers were uneasy. A boy had been seen near his place, dark-haired and dressed in buckskin. People asked questions. Some wondered aloud whether he had thrown in with the Apache, whether he was giving shelter to an enemy. On one visit into town for supplies, he felt the eyes on him. Conversations paused as he passed, men tipping back their hats, narrowing their gaze. He kept his business quick, but the whispers followed him out the door. By the time he rode back toward his cabin, he could feel the noose tightening. The boy's presence was no longer a secret. That night, as the fire burned low, the man sat with the child beside him. The boy clutched the small wooden horse he had carved, dragging its legs across the dirt floor in slow circles. The rider watched him and thought of how quickly children could bind themselves to a man's heart. In just a few weeks, this boy had changed the shape of his days. Yet he could not shake the feeling that his home was no longer his own, that it had become the center of two storms closing in. One storm carried the silence of the Apache women. The other carried the suspicions of his own kind. A few mornings later, the storm broke the quiet. Hoofbeats came first, heavy, measured, not the soft tread of hunters, but the clatter of men who wanted to be heard. The rider stepped outside, rifle in hand, the boy watching from the doorway. First settlers rode up, their faces shadowed beneath wide brims, their coats heavy against the cold. They reined in near the fence, eyes fixed on the cabin. "Word is you're keeping company that don't belong here," one of them said flatly. His voice was not raised, but it carried the weight of men who thought they spoke for the whole town. The rider stood steady. "The boy was starving," he answered. "I did what any man would do." "That boy ain't yours," another said, spitting into the dirt. "You know how this looks? Folks out here don't take kindly to mixing with Apache. Trouble follows. Always does." The boy shrank back into the doorway, clutching the wooden horse tighter. The rider's jaw clenched. He had no patience for men who spoke of children as if they were burdens. But he also knew better than to let anger drive his words. "He's under my roof," he said evenly. "That makes him my responsibility." The men exchanged glances, mutters low between them. One leaned forward in his saddle. "Responsibility's one thing. But when they come for him, what then? You planning to stand in their way?" The question hung like a knife in the air. The rider did not answer. He knew they weren't really asking, they were warning. The men turned their horses and rode back toward town, but their words stayed behind, heavy as stone. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the rider saw shapes moving along the ridge again. 3 figures, still and patient, watching. The women had returned. He felt the conflict close in around him, both sides tightening their grip. On one side, suspicion and threat. On the other, silent demands and kinship. And in the middle, a boy who wanted both to cling and to flee. The next days blurred together with unease. The rider kept close to the cabin, his rifle never far. He taught the boy to feed the horse, to stack kindling, to fetch water from the creek. Small things, yet each moment carried weight. At night, the child sometimes whispered words in Apache, his small voice laced with longing. The man wished he could understand. He wondered if those words were prayers or names, or pleas for a family that still lived. One night, the boy woke screaming, clutching at the rider as though he had dreamed of being taken away. The man held him until his sobs quieted, but the sound lingered long after. It was not the cry of a child afraid of the dark. It was the cry of a child caught between two worlds, not knowing which would claim him. By the end of the week, tension struck from both sides. In town, more whispers grew into talk of action. A man at the general store told him plainly, "You can't keep that boy here. Folks won't stand for it." The rider said nothing, but he felt the coldness in the man's stare. Back home, the women drew nearer, their tracks visible by the creek. Their shadows at dusk, closer than before. One evening, as the wind howled across the prairie, the rider stepped outside and found the women standing no more than 20 paces away. They had come without horses, their eyes fixed on him. The boy ran to the door, froze, and then pressed himself against the frame. Caught in that same pull again, the lead woman spoke softly, words he could not understand. But her voice carried a tone both commanding and mournful. She held out her hand, palm open, waiting. The boy stirred, torn, his small feet shifting toward her. Yet at the same time, he looked back at the man as though begging him to decide. The rider's heart pounded. He felt the walls of his world closing in. If he let the boy go, what would become of him? Would he vanish into the hills, never to be seen again? If he kept him, how long before settlers rode out in force? He knew he could not hold this ground forever, yet something in him resisted giving the boy up. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of fire inside the cabin. The boy's small voice rose, speaking that word again, the one that stirred emotion in the women. This time it came louder, clearer, like a call. The women's eyes filled with something raw, but still they did not step closer. The man tightened his grip on the rifle. He felt the weight of choice pressing harder than ever. Behind him, the cabin glowed warm against the cold. Before him, 3 women waited, unyielding. And beyond them, somewhere in the distance, settlers whispered of action. The prairie had become a stage set for collision. Every path pointed toward confrontation, yet none offered peace. The boy clutched his wooden horse, eyes wide, his body trembling. The rider braced himself, knowing the next move would carry them all to the edge of whatever fate had in store. The wind rose, whistling through the grass. The fire inside hissed. The boy whispered again, his voice a thread binding them all. And in that moment, the man knew the climax of this struggle was near, closer than ever, and that no choice would leave them untouched. The fire inside the small cabin had burned down to glowing coals by the time the long night ended. The man sat at the table, his rough hands folded, eyes heavy but mind still restless. The boy, no longer the starving child he had found days ago, was curled under a blanket, sleeping deeply and breathing steady. The Apache women who had come searching for him had not left in anger nor in silence. Instead, they had chosen to remain until morning, keeping watch by the fire with the same care he had given. The weight of their presence lingered, a reminder that what had begun as an act of mercy had tied his life to theirs in ways he could not untangle when dawn spilled over the plains. Painting the sky in bands of rose and gold, the women stepped out with the boy and spoke quietly among themselves. He could hear their voices carrying on the wind, soft yet firm, full of meaning he only partly understood. One of them approached him with a nod, her expression not of gratitude alone, but of respect. In her eyes, he saw a bridge forming where there once had been only suspicion. She told him that the boy was of their people, the son of a fallen warrior, and that his survival meant more than he could know. The man listened, realizing he had not only saved a child, but kept alive a piece of a people who had already lost so much in the days that followed. The cabin was no longer a place of isolation. The boy played near the creek, laughter echoing in a way the man had not heard in years. The women brought food, herbs, and stories. They told him of their village, of the hardships they endured, of the encroaching weight of settlers and soldiers that pressed against their lives like an unyielding wall. In turn, he shared with them what little he had, tools, firewood, and a roof when storms rolled in. It was an uneasy friendship at first, stitched together by circumstance. But slowly, it became something stronger. There were still questions he could not shake. Why had fate led him to find the boy at the exact moment he was most needed? Why had the women trusted him, a man outside their world, instead of taking the boy and leaving without a word? He carried those questions in silence, knowing some answers would never come. But what did come was trust, carved carefully from acts of kindness on both sides. The tension of the past gave way to the rhythm of survival. Survival bound them together more tightly than fear ever could. The village nearby soon took notice. Farmers and townsfolk whispered about the Apache women who came to the cabin, about the child who ran freely across the meadow. Some warned him that trouble would follow, that he was risking more than his reputation. But he could not see it that way. To him, the boy was no longer just Apache or settler. He was a child who had once been starving and now had a chance at life. That was all that mattered. He told the townsfolk as much, though few believed his words could ever outweigh the suspicions carved deep into old wounds. As time passed, the bond between the women and the man deepened. They worked side by side, mending fences, gathering firewood, tending to the small garden behind the cabin. The boy grew stronger, his laughter filling the air like music against the loneliness that had once haunted the place. Each moment seemed to stitch together to worlds that were never meant to meet. And yet somehow here, in the shadow of the plains, they had. The true resolution did not come with a grand moment or a loud declaration, but with the quiet choice to continue. The women could have taken the boy back to their people, yet they returned often, as though they too had found something unexpected in this bond. The man could have turned them away, fearing what others might think, but he did not. And the child, who had once been at the edge of death, was now at the center of a small circle of life built on unlikely trust. The seasons changed, and with them came reminders of hardship. Harsh winters threatened their food supplies, and storms tore at the roof of the cabin. Yet each trial was faced together, each struggle woven into the fabric of their story. The boy would sit by the fire at night, his eyes wide as the women told him of the stars and the spirits of their ancestors, while the man would listen in silence, humbled by the richness of a world he had once thought closed to him. What had begun as an act of mercy became something far greater. It was proof that kindness could carve through fear, that humanity could rise above suspicion. In the late 1800s, in a land scarred by division and conflict, a single cabin had become a place where walls were lowered and new paths forged. The man had not only saved a starving Apache child, he had opened his door to something larger than himself. Years later, when the boy was no longer small and fragile, but tall and strong, he would remember those first days not as a time of hunger and loss, but as the moment when lives intertwined against all odds. He would carry with him the lessons of both worlds, shaped by the man who had offered him shelter and by the women who had refused to let their kin be forgotten. And in that balance, there was a hope that perhaps the divides of the old village days could be softened, if not erased, by choices made and simple acts of compassion. The story does not end with declarations of victory, nor with promises that all wounds were healed. The truth of that time was harsher than any tale could soften. Yet in the midst of suspicion and hardship, there had been a spark, a boy saved, a door opened, a bond formed where no one expected it. That spark was enough to remind those who carried it forward that even in the hardest times, humanity could still be found. And so, the man, the boy, and the three Apache women continued on, each day writing a story that did not erase the past, but refused to be bound by it. In the quiet of the plains, their lives became a reminder of what could be built when fear was set aside. That truth, though small in the sweep of history, was everything to them. It was said that the boy, grown and strong, would one day tell others of how his life began, not with abandonment, but with a hand reaching down to lift him up. He would speak of firelight, of the scent of wood smoke, of the sound of voices that carried both sorrow and hope. And though the old conflicts never fully vanished, his story stood as proof that sometimes the greatest changes begin not in battles or in courts, but in the quiet choice of one man to open his door to strangers. The cabin, weathered and worn by time, remained standing long after. Travelers who passed by would see it and hear whispers of the tale that once. In the late 1800s, a man found a starving Apache child, and that 4 days later, 3 Apache women stood at his door. They would say it was a story of survival, of courage, and of humanity. And those who listened closely would understand that in its heart, it was about more than a single act of mercy. It was about how one choice made in the stillness of the plains could change the course of many lives. The story closed not with an ending, but with a legacy. And that legacy carried forward, a quiet reminder in a land that had seen too much division that sometimes compassion itself was the greatest act of defiance.